Well, hello everyone. It is so great to join you. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Sarah Godlewski. I am the Secretary of State for Wisconsin, and I'm also a working mom. I have a 4-year-old son, and childcare is always top of mind in my household. I was actually thinking about my last big childcare issue that we were dealing with, and a lot of that was actually during the pandemic. My kid was actually 4 months old when that hit, and we didn't know what we were going to do. And now, even a few years later, the childcare crisis still exists. In my state in Wisconsin, over half our state is in a childcare desert, and 70% of our rural areas are in a childcare desert. So parents continue to share stories with me about how they have really no options but to quit their jobs, not because they don't want to work, but because they have no other options on where to send their kids. So I'm really excited about our childcare panel today and the important work that these three panelists are doing across the country. So I'm going to take a minute to introduce them. First, we have Senator Grant Hauschild. Grant is in his first term representing Minnesota's 1st Senate District. He's the father of 2 young kids and knows how hard it is to find childcare, particularly in rural areas like northern Minnesota. Grant also serves as the executive director of a healthcare foundation where he raises money for patients' families who can't afford costs associated with their care. Next, we have Lea Woods. Lea is a senior policy associate in the Women's Economic Justice Department at the Century Foundation, where her work focuses on a range of issues, including paid family leave and childcare. Prior to joining the Century Foundation, Lea worked in the Economic Analysis and Research Network at the Economic Policy Institute. And last but not least, we have Sarah Vanover. Sarah has been working in the field of early childhood education for over 24 years and has had the opportunity to be a teacher, a director, a professor, and a trainer for other early childhood educators. For over the past several years, she has focused her work and research on assessing quality early childcare programs for health and safety requirements and school readiness skills. Sarah has also published her 9th book on childcare and early education, which is exciting. So Grant, Lee, and Sarah, thank you for joining us today. And so I'm going to turn to some questions, and just as a reminder to those in the audience that we will be taking questions through the kind of Q&A button that you have below, and we'll be kind of mixing them throughout the next hour. So Grant, I want to start with you. This year, you introduced legislation that was called the Great Start Affordability Act to help families cover the cost of childcare. So can you tell us maybe a little bit more about this bill, what the bill is going to do, and why you saw this need in your rural Senate district in northern Minnesota?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah, for having me on this panel and for hosting. I'm Grant Hauschild, like you said, and I represent the most rural district in Minnesota. It's really the entire arrowhead tip of northern Minnesota. And so I get to interact with a lot of communities that are a couple of hundred people. And what I've found is that I have a lot of communities where there quite literally is no childcare. And what that means is we have this chicken or egg problem where families maybe want to stay or resettle back home in their rural communities, but they can't get the childcare that they need. And the costs are so much higher in greater Minnesota because there's just not the same number of slots in competition as there might be in a suburb or a more urban environment. So the Great Start Childcare Affordability Bill that I introduced would really look to get to the middle class in Minnesota to try to help with the increasing costs of childcare. In the 2023 legislative session, we really focused on helping families really in need in those lower income levels. We also provided some childcare stability grants to childcare centers, but now we want to reach that middle class family. And what we really had in mind were 3 goals. We wanted to make sure that our families really could feel the support coming to them rather than a retroactive application for a tax credit. We also wanted to provide stability to our childcare centers by sending the money directly to them and sort of providing that certainty that there was a subsidy available to them. And then lastly, we wanted to make sure that we were reaching high enough in the income ladder to really impact poor families that were deciding between whether or not they wanted to start a family or not. What this program does is it gives a grant directly to a childcare center based on applications of the families that attend or are looking to attend that center. Then what they do is they use that grant to help support the costs of childcare, and they're required to provide a line item to families directly each month indicating the subsidy that that family receives. So it's kind of a win-win for childcare centers, which is really important to greater Minnesota and rural Minnesota, but also a line item subsidy to those families. So I think it's a win-win for everybody involved.
Well, that's exciting, Grant, and I know that it's been a conversation as far as how can we do this, and using grants to be able, I think, to help meet those needs is something that we need to do more of. I want to kind of open it up too to some of our other panelists. You know, we have been, as I mentioned, in Wisconsin, 70% of our state in rural Wisconsin has a childcare desert, while in, main parts it's only 50. So can we maybe talk about why is the childcare crisis worse in rural parts of the country, and what are some things that we think we can do about it?
I can start on that, Sarah. So in Kentucky, we have 120 counties, and 79 of those are childcare deserts. And many of those are in Western and Eastern Kentucky, which in Western Kentucky, that's rural area, that's farmland. And in Eastern Kentucky, that's rural areas, that's coal country, Appalachian Mountains. And one of the reasons that we see such a significant challenge there is transportation. Families are spaced much further apart. Transporting children to centers can be much harder if there's not a centralized location that everybody can access. In our larger communities, if you open a center for a childcare program with 100 slots, many families are close enough that they can all come to that center together. But if you open a center for 100 children in a rural area, you don't have that many families that can transport themselves to it. We're just too far apart, or there may not be community transportation, things of that nature. So you really have to rely more on family childcare homes, smaller centers, things of that nature. We also have to think about the federal government's required for the market rate survey. So in our rural areas, tuition is lower because there's more poverty for us in those rural areas. And what we see is that families can pay less. And when families pay less, then our childcare providers get paid less. And so it's very hard to staff a facility when you have to worry about if the staff are only making minimum wage. We don't have additional requirements above the federal minimum wage in Kentucky. And so we see that low income for our childcare providers, which is a challenge statewide, becomes even more exacerbated in our rural areas, and may deter a lot of our childcare providers to leave the workforce and get that government support when it's not worth it for them to be able to work full-time and still have to ask for programs like SNAP and TANF in order to pay their own bills.
That was so helpful. I'd love to build off of what you just said and jump in there as well, if that's okay. So some of the challenges that rural families are facing are non-unique, which is just to say they also exist in urban areas, but the way that these problems present themselves and their solutions might look a bit different for rural communities. So what we want ideally is for childcare to be affordable and high quality and guaranteed for all of the families who need it. And the reason that we're all here today is it's obviously not any of those things yet. The first issue is that it's incredibly expensive, and this is true in rural communities. It's true nationwide. And so a recent report from Childcare Aware shows that childcare tuition exceeds families' mortgage payments in 45 states and DC, and that's just unsustainable, right? And the challenge is that in order for providers to lower these tuition prices, they would need to lower wages. And for reasons that Sarah already explained, they really can't do that because early educators are already paid these poverty level wages, and that's a primary cause for turnover and low retention rates in the sector. And that has implications for the quality of service that these programs are able to provide, because when you have these really passionate and experienced early educators who are quitting their jobs, it becomes disruptive for kids. And we want to have high quality programs because young children during those first years of life are going through the most brain development and growth that they will for the rest of their lives, and we want to set them up for success. But it also has implications for supply and availability because, as Sarah said, a lot of these childcare providers can't fill the number of childcare slots that they're licensed to provide because they can't find early educators who are willing to work for these really, really low wages. And this is just exacerbated in rural communities because they're disproportionately likely to use home-based childcare providers who have not bounced back to pre-pandemic levels since COVID-19, and because childcare deserts are most likely to be in these low-income rural census tracts. And so in rural communities, you can't just build a new childcare program to fix the supplies shortage, partly because it's prohibitively expensive, and partly because, again, as Sarah said, transportation issues, right? Even if you build the program, not everyone will be able to come join it. And so finally, I think it's challenging for these home-based care providers who are so needed in rural areas to get licensed or to get access to the capital that they need to launch businesses. So it becomes hard to expand supply. And I just want to note that while part of the solution is definitely to make it easier for these providers to get licensed, the big solution is honestly just going to be public funding to resolve the childcare crisis. Because what you have is a broken market. Families can't pay more for tuition, but providers can't, lower tuition rates. And so the way to resolve that is the influx or investment of public funds.
Lea, I want to actually further dive into that because I think there's a lot of different options when we talk about how government and public funds can play a role. As we're seeing here in Wisconsin, providers, especially in rural Wisconsin, these childcare providers are leaving and they can make more money at a local gas station than providing care for our kids, which are our future, even though they have a degree, they've been well educated, and they're just trying to, serve in the best interest of their family. And so knowing that affordability is, of course, about families and the work that, Grant talked about in Minnesota, but it's also about affordability and quality for the provider. And we know government is critical to helping with that, but what does that exactly look like?
I think the best way to answer that question is by looking at what the federal government has already done, because we have sort of an example from the past few years. During the pandemic, between December of 2019 and March of 2021, the US lost 9% of its center-based childcare programs and 10% of its family childcare programs. It was a huge disaster for the sector. And so the federal government stepped in and invested $52 billion, which was a historic amount in the childcare sector. And that went a long way toward stabilizing it. And the losses that the sector experienced would have been much, much worse without that funding. And so ARPA stabilization funds alone, which accounted for less than half of that $52 billion, served 220,000 childcare providers and saved the jobs of more than 1 million early educators nationwide. So if you look at one state, a rural state like North Dakota, which as of 2020 was the second least populous state in the country, they got an influx of $46.7 million, and that went to over 1,000 providers, and a majority of those were family childcare homes. And they used those to cover rent and mortgage payments, and they used those to cover personnel expenses, their overhead costs, which are very low. I mean, overhead for most childcare programs is 1% to 4%, incredibly low. And so these funds helped providers stay afloat despite all of the problems that were happening throughout the pandemic and have continued helping sustain these programs as inflation and rising operating costs have become an issue. But obviously, those funds were a short-term solution because they expire, right? And so stabilization funds expired last September, CCDBG supplemental funds expired this September, and that just means less money is going to be going to providers to cover these operating expenses. So I hope that at least partially answered your question.
I can add to that a little bit. I think, one of the things we've looked at in Kentucky, again, the federal funding was amazing, but we know that it was limited to this one-time influx. And I live in a very fiscally conservative state. And so, although Kentucky has made historic investments in early childhood education in the past couple of years that it's never made before, it still doesn't have the funding to continue the stabilization payments and some of the things that centers were really crying out for as those federal funds left. And so we really had to start thinking out of the box on ways to support our child care providers. Many of our child care providers do not have health insurance because the programs themselves can't afford to pay the payment to offset that cost. And the providers themselves can't take an extra $300 a month out of their paychecks either to pay for health insurance. So we know that that's not there. The average wage in Kentucky for even veteran child care providers is $12.39 an hour. So we were trying to find ways to entice people not to leave to go work at Target or at Arby's or, hospitality and retail. And so one of the things that Kentucky did was made our childcare employees, whether they were a teacher, an administrator, however they work, categorically eligible for the subsidy program. So if you work 20 hours a week in childcare, then your own childcare tuition is waived. So everybody that is working in those programs, they could make $4 an hour more at Target, but they would still be paying for their own childcare. But if you didn't have to pay the cost of childcare, then it would be worth it to work in the field that you love and come back to that, be in the center with your own children, watch them grow up, watch them go on the field trip to the pumpkin patch in the fall, the kind of things that the teachers want. We know that these teachers aren't growing up as young children saying, when I grow up, I want to stock shelves. They're saying, when I grow up, I want to work with young children, but then they get to be an adult and realize that they can't feed their family on it. But if we can find ways to do that uniquely that we haven't thought about before, like offsetting this cost. Plus, when the state has paid the full cost of that tuition for the families, the centers who may have prorated some of that tuition before to entice people, if they paid 25% or 50%, they're getting the full amount. So they're more financially stable too. And so some of these non-traditional methods of enticing providers to the field, supporting them in new ways, may be a way that government can step in instead of the stabilization payments that many states said we can't continue to do this. We can find more unique programs that not only build up our workforce, but support our centers.
I would just add, I traveled around my district to a lot of rural communities talking to childcare providers, and a lot of them were terrified when those federal stabilization grants were going away. And in Minnesota, we actually did extend those at the state level to really fill that gap. But unfortunately, not every state is making that decision, right? And so there's a lot of childcare providers that have seen that huge cliff happen, and that's a real challenge. I just want to talk a little personally here. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and talking about the pay for these childcare providers. I had a situation where I was at a local retailer walking with my kids, and I hear from behind me somebody calling to my son, Henry, come here. And I look over and it's one of his teachers. And we go up and say hi to her. And she said, yeah, this is the third job I'm working in order to get by. And I just had this extreme guilt come over me thinking, this woman takes care of my kids during the day while I do my job in public service. I'm out shopping with my kids and she's busy working at night trying to just get by. And then she has another job on top of it. So we really do have a broken system here where we, again, are charging families way too much for them to be able to afford starting a family. And we have childcare providers who are barely getting by, probably doing it because of the passion they have for kids and education. But unfortunately, it's just not a system we can continue. I do want to just add one last piece. I represent, again, a really rural area, but I also represent the Iron Range, which is a heavy mining industry area. And a lot of our rural communities are dependent on single industries that maybe happen to pay really high wages, but it's a limited number of jobs, and rural communities sort of size themselves to fit those industries. I have found that in those mining communities compared to maybe other rural communities, they really struggle because families are actually making an okay wage. But when it comes to diversifying the economy and finding other opportunities for things like childcare, it's really, really a struggle because they can't really get those folks to move to those communities when other wages are a lot higher. So we face this just chicken or egg problem again that I keep repeating because we have the industries that really dominate those regions.
When I think, Grant, when you talk about, for example, a mining industry, it's another area to explore. Is that we've talked about what the federal government is doing, what we need them to continue to do, knowing that a lot of our states with the running of ARPA funds are going to face soon, if they have not already, this childcare cliff. But where does private sector, our employers, come into play? I mean, we are seeing sometimes record breaking profit margins for some of these employers, and their employees need childcare so they can come to work. And so, what are some things that we are seeing or should be considered when it comes to responsibility of the private sector and our employers?
I think it's a great point, and we've actually seen a couple of rural hospitals step in this space where they've started providing childcare in rural communities like Ely and Duluth in my region. So I think there are opportunities. I'd love to see some sort of matching grants or matching opportunities from the state government or federal government to incentivize private employers to provide these types of things. But you're exactly right. If folks want to get the workforce that they need, they should really step up to the plate to make sure they're providing the benefits to their employees that they need. And maybe childcare starts to become one of those pieces that's part of a benefit package for those families. The other thing that we see a lot is in rural communities, the community foundations or initiative foundations, whatever they might be called in your local state or community, are really stepping into this space and partnering with the private sector and other private donations to really start up childcare centers. I've seen that in a couple of communities. So there are opportunities for nonprofits to play a middleman, I think, in the development of these childcare centers in some communities.
I think a lot of the interest or the response from the business community depends a lot on the size of the business. So we have a Toyota manufacturing plant in Kentucky, and they have a gorgeous, large on-site childcare program, but they have a plant that's the size of a small town. And so they have the ability to do that. But when you think about small and medium-sized businesses being the majority of employers in the state, you have to think a little bit different. If you have 15 employees, you're not going to create on-site childcare, and that's where it can be a little trickier. Helping businesses to find a way to partner with childcare programs in a different way can be essential. Even a business saying, I'm going to create a partnership with these two family childcare homes, and I will subsidize the cost of my employees' childcare, and then they can save spots for us or put us first on the wait list. Finding a way to kind of have a symbiotic relationship where you support each other and make sure that your employees know that I'm giving a stipend to this program, this center, this family childcare home, and they're gonna help you. One of the things that Kentucky started 2 years ago out of our state house, this House Bill 499, and what it did was create a matching fund between the employer and the state to help subsidize the cost of childcare. It's a little bit different than Michigan's TRICARE program. Michigan's TRICARE kind of divided things up between the family, the employer, and the state. This program in Kentucky allows the employer to decide, hey, I can't pay for the cost of childcare, but I can contribute $100. And then the state can up to match that $100. And so, Grant's talked about the cost of childcare. I had an infant and a 2-year-old at the same time. And though $200 isn't a huge amount, if somebody was paying $200 a month for me, I would have taken it just to reduce the cost that I was already having. So in this case, there's a contract between the employer, the state, and the family. And each one says, I'm going to pay this amount. And then the family pays the balance. And it gives employers a lot of freedom as far as how much they want to contribute, because not everybody can match the employee 50-50, or not everybody can say I can pay a third. But again, $100 contribution, any type of contribution, is a good way to entice employees for the business, makes those employees more likely to stay, but also really helps people enter the workforce when they don't have to carry the full burden of their childcare costs.
And Sarah, was this program regardless of the size of the employer? Because we know in particular small businesses really struggle with, providing anything, knowing that they're often living day to day. So is this regardless of the size of the business?
Any type of employer could apply to be a part of it, but there was a certain amount of those funds that was specifically dedicated to small and medium-sized businesses so that large employers couldn't kind of come in and take over the program.
Yeah, this is a very timely question. I think there have been a number of articles just over the past couple weeks about employer-sponsored childcare and on-site childcare. And the Department of Commerce and the U.S. Chamber Foundation are actually hosting a summit in a couple weeks so that the business community can come together with labor unions and childcare advocates and answer this question about what role private corporations and businesses should play in the childcare sector. And I think that really speaks to just how serious the childcare crisis has really become, because a lot of businesses are saying that they already understand how childcare shortages are impacting them, right? Like childcare advocates don't have to go to the business community necessarily and make that case. 62% of employers cite childcare as a reason that they've lost employees from their workforce. And so the question is, to what extent is it the business community's responsibility to solve this crisis? Because businesses are really experimenting with childcare as a benefit to retain employees, but have also said that they don't want this to be another healthcare, and it shouldn't be for them, because childcare should be treated as a public good, and that means that the government should ultimately be responsible for subsidizing the childcare sector, as is the case in most other industrialized countries. But because that goal is so far off, and while we're working toward this comprehensive and publicly funded childcare sector, there are things that the private sector can do. They can, and in some cases already are, advocating for public investment in the childcare sector. But public-private partnerships in childcare also do have the potential to fill gaps in the existing system, as long as they're thoughtful and responsibly implemented. And so what we want to see is for these partnerships to engage community stakeholders like state and local governments and parents and childcare providers, so that the plans that they're implementing are reflecting the needs of the communities that they're based in. We want to see them expand existing childcare infrastructure, especially by investing in home-based or family childcare programs. Because I think when companies think about childcare, they're often under the impression that they need to start a new program from scratch. And that's a huge lift for a company, and it puts the impetus on people who are not childcare experts to design childcare plans. So it's really to the benefit of both companies and local childcare providers to build off of what is already there. We also want companies to get input from childcare providers to ensure that the partnerships that they're developing are leading to plans that compensate these early educators well. Because again, as we've said, bad wages create retention and supply issues in the childcare sector. And so good jobs that provide benefits and opportunities for professional development ensure that these plans that public-private partnerships are developing are sustainable over time. And then finally, public-private partnerships do not want to be prescriptive in the kind of childcare that they're offering. And so this is one of several reasons why it's not always ideal for employers to just invest in on-site care. For example, families might prefer home-based childcare, and we want to give families options. And so companies should ideally provide families with a menu of options so that they can choose the kind of childcare that works best for them.
And those options really come into play for families who have a child with a disability, for families who don't speak English as their primary language, for families who have a child with a chronic health condition. So when we think of typically developing kids, there's a lot of times a path that if the business created a childcare program, they could say, okay, this will serve most kids. But that family choice component really comes into play when we look at more of an equity piece and think about our kiddos with disabilities and the type of care that they might need that isn't just offered in the community typically.
And Sarah, I think that's a really good point, is that in addition to care, we know that there's a certain kind of care that even is harder to access for a lot of families, especially if their child is dealing with a disability, and knowing that's often the least subsidized area for parents to get help. And so I want to kind of also go back and look at what we are seeing coming out of, for example, the CHIPS and Science Act. We know that they now have a provision mandating childcare for their workers. And I mean, how do you think this is going to, like, what kind of impact do you think we will see as a result of this mandate?
That is also a great question. And I think the answer is that it really depends because this is the first time that a federal infrastructure bill has required grant recipients to provide childcare. So if it goes well, and by that I just mean if manufacturing companies manage to build an adequate supply of childcare near their fabrication plants for their workers, then future infrastructure bills might include similar requirements. So this could set a standard for providing workforce supports like childcare for future infrastructure projects, which would be very great. The issue is that success is not assured, and there are just a lot of ways for poorly implemented childcare plans to do harm to local childcare markets. So, if instead these manufacturing companies subsidize childcare for their workers without building a supply of childcare programs, there's the risk that they could raise tuition rates and decrease the supply of available programs for other families in the community who aren't a part of those manufacturing companies. Or if these companies partner exclusively with large corporate childcare providers, particularly those that are owned by private equity companies, they could push smaller home-based care providers out of the market. And we don't want to see that happen, right? And so if manufacturing companies fail to provide childcare altogether, then other employers who are not part of this CHIPS and Science Act might not find it worthwhile to invest in childcare. They might start backing out of the whole employer-sponsored childcare benefit. So I just don't want to like put the cart before the horse and assume that this is all going to go great. I think it has the potential to change how manufacturing and construction companies go about creating good jobs and how they put together benefits packages. But if they do, it's going to be because it helps them recruit and retain a diverse workforce, especially one that includes women. So it has the potential to be a good thing, but we're keeping an eye on it.
We also have to think about these are manufacturing companies and they are in the business of manufacturing, but being in the business of childcare is very different. So if you're looking at expanding, if you want to do on-site childcare, are you going to do it as a manufacturer and not know the ins and outs of the business? Or are you going to partner with somebody, hire a specialist or bring in an organization in your community that understands the regulations, the health and safety aspects, the liability? There's a lot to consider when you're thinking, of course, I'm a business, I can open a childcare program. But sitting down and reading childcare regulations, whether they're federal or state, it's like reading a refrigerator manual. So bringing in somebody who is an expert on the content and making sure that the program is high quality instead of just there to meet a federal grant requirement is going to be a big portion of this. But these businesses, they're hiring people from millennial and Gen Z generations. These are generations that want work-life balance and they want more unique benefits than baby boomers who were willing to be there 30 minutes before the boss and stay until after the boss was gone. So they have a different expectation of what businesses should offer them. And so, manufacturing businesses, technology businesses, they have to be able to keep up with the generations they're wanting to hire. And that, creating this work-life balance, making family a priority is something that they're going to be charged with moving forward by the type of employee they want to have.
Well, I think what we are seeing, whether it's at the federal level for the first time or in Minnesota with the senator's programs, it's about being creative and starting somewhere, right? Because we can talk about it all we want, but we're not going to know unless we actually start pushing the needle and implementing. And we've heard about some really interesting things that are happening in Kentucky and federally and now in Minnesota. And I think when you guys are also looking across the entire country or other places, are there other innovative or creative solutions that you think can be done here when it comes to addressing the childcare crisis.
One other thing, just going back to Minnesota, because that's my experience, we are starting a new agency for youth and families, which I think will do a lot in the regulatory sphere to try to reduce those burdens on childcare centers, at-home care providers, streamline the application processes, be more accessible to those folks. So our hope is kind of separating that from the health and human services bucket, which is in and of itself a ginormous agency, making sure that we're really focused our bureaucracy on this critical core service will be a really interesting test case, I think, for the nation on how we can better utilize our government to support this industry and this expansion. I also just really briefly want to talk about kind of the politics of this. One interesting thing and pushback you do get is, why are we supporting childcare for families? Back in my day, you just raised your kids and you let them run free and they did what they wanted, right? And we got by. Why can't millennials like me and people younger than me? And it's super interesting because in the last session, I mean, we do so much for seniors, right? And rightfully so. I was an advocate for reducing Social Security taxes for seniors. I was an advocate for expanding the match for Medicare for a lot of our rural healthcare services in Minnesota. Never once when we did those things did I hear from a millennial parent saying, why did you give Social Security tax relief to seniors but not address childcare? But the minute I introduce a childcare subsidy program, I start hearing from a lot of folks in the older generation saying, what in tarnation are you doing here? And so we've got to find a way to really make folks understand that the vibrancy, especially in our rural communities, depends on us addressing modern day challenges like childcare. If we want families to return home or stay in their communities, we have to find a way to be able to provide these services. I think the last thing I would say is that it's a known thing that we invest in K through 12 education in this country. It's a value, everybody understands it. We spend 80% of our childcare fund, or excuse me, childhood funding on K through 12 education. But we know the research shows that development between ages 0 and 5 is the most important development stages in a child's life. And yet we invest such a small percentage of our public investments during those critical years. And so trying to not necessarily take away from K through 12 education, but how do we shift the mindset of the public to understand how critically important it is that we treat childcare and early education as a public good, like Lea was saying, so that they understand how important those investments will be to future crime statistics, future workforce opportunities, the creation of families, and a domestic growth of our communities. I just really think there's a lot of need to get that message across to communities, especially in rural and greater Minnesota and the nation.
And it's so helpful to hear the senator talk about the political aspect of this, because even when there are really great pilot programs or really great examples of how you can resolve the childcare crisis or an aspect of it, right? It doesn't necessarily last. And so here in DC, we have the Pay Equity Fund, and it supplements early educator wages and brings them in line with similarly educated professions in the DC public school system. That's super great because, as we've said in this conversation already, early childhood educators are some of the lowest paid workers in the country. And so DC's Pay Equity Fund has enabled them to afford basics and necessities like groceries, but also to invest in bigger expenses like a down payment on a home, which in today's world for millennials and for Gen Z is such a huge deal. And so this has increased employment retention levels for early educators by nearly 7% in DC, compared with estimates of employment levels in places that have not established a pay equity fund. But then the problem is, in the political aspect, childcare advocates in DC are fighting to keep this program and to continue funding for this program. DC is facing a budget deficit, and so the program has been threatened with a major cut in the fiscal year 25 budget. And that is the way it goes. Even if you have a program that's proven to work, it has been effective and everybody loves it. When budget cuts come by, then some of these social services, and particularly for childcare, are the first to go because people feel that they're extraneous. And so I think that's part of the narrative that has to be changed. Early childhood education is not extraneous, it's not a nice to have. It is core infrastructure to our nation, both for workforce reasons, but also it's crucial for families, for children, for the well-being of our communities. And so, like, we know kind of what programs work, but it's also a matter of keeping and maintaining them.
And I would back up everything that Lea said. You know, we talk about early childhood education in Kentucky being as essential to state infrastructure as transportation funds and road repairs, because without that in place, we can't get people to their job destinations. Now, for me, I'm a teacher at heart. I started off as an early childhood special ed teacher, and I want to see those great, wonderful early childhood environments. But we also have to think about the independence of the family. If mom or dad or our caregiver can go to work, then they're going to be able to be more autonomous. Children are going to have secure food sources. They're going to have stable housing. They're going to have reliable transportation. And with that, we know that they're going to develop and grow and not have to worry about safe learning environments. They're going to go to work. The family will go to work, not worry about the children. The children will go to school, not worry about when is the next time I'm going to eat. When is where am I going to sleep tonight? They're going to have more successful learning experiences. And then the family as a whole is going to be able to be more independent. And that's one of our major goals with early childhood education too, is that we want to see families who are independent and can stand on their own. The other thing that I would stress that Lea said is that wage supplement programs around the US, what DC is doing, sorry about that, what DC is doing, what North Carolina is doing, making sure that the wages increase is really got to be our top priority for our early childhood providers. Because, if I go to the Apple store, I'm there to buy a computer. That's why I went there. When you go to an early childhood program, the teacher is the key resource that they are providing. That's who I'm leaving my precious baby with. And if we don't have quality teachers in those environments, then we have families that don't want to utilize that childcare. And to have quality teachers, we have got to pay them. We can't subsidize the centers on the backs of the childcare providers anymore. It's just not the way that we're going to attract and keep a quality early childhood workforce. So finding ways, one of the things I love about the workforce supplement programs in a lot of places is that the longer you stay at the same program, then you get an additional wage supports. So it's reducing turnover, it's rewarding people who have or complete more education programs for themselves. And it's helping to make sure that our providers are not making a minimum wage to take care of our country's most important asset.
So we're hearing about these really critical programs, making sure we can pay our child care providers, or how are we making sure we're providing family subsidies. And yet, at the same time, we're seeing child care continue to be treated like a political football. Whether it's in DC and with Leah's example and how it was the first to go. During the pandemic, Delta Airlines got more money than childcare, which to me was absolutely infuriating. And so we know that it's critical for our economy. It's critical for our kids' future. As the senator talked about, this is a American value when it comes to public education and our kids. And so as stakeholders, how do you think we can maybe further engage with policymakers to ensure that this is a priority and stopped being treated like the afterthought that it is?
I think one of the biggest political advantages is showing people what happens when they don't have something, frankly. When childcare isn't available, when families start to feel that, when communities start to feel that, all of a sudden you start to hear a lot more from constituents. One thing that happened this last year is we had a day without childcare, and a lot of Iron Range childcare centers shut down. All of them sort of came together and agreed to essentially have a day on strike alongside their childcare workers. They came down to the Capitol, they advocated, they met with legislators, they met with the governor's office, and those community members had to stay home from work to be with their kids. The mines, the businesses in those rural communities had to sort of take that on. And the awesome thing about it was the parents were supportive. Like the very parents who were the ones that had to take a day off understood because they were bought into this idea that childcare is a public good, that the childcare providers they were sending their kids to were not getting paid enough, that there weren't enough childcare services in our communities. And so it was pretty powerful to see that happen. But I think the more that we can show businesses and communities that imagine what it would be like if you had even less childcare. What would it be like if you didn't have childcare providers? Let's show people how critically important this is, and then I think people may start listening.
What's so funny about this is that polling shows time and time again that childcare is an incredibly popular policy issue. So it doesn't seem as though it should be an issue where it's so difficult to get forward momentum and progress. There's always a at least supermajority, like over 66% of people who are in favor of affordable childcare and having policymakers do something to make childcare more affordable. Um, and I think there are ways to communicate this that are more effective than others. So one of the things that we've done is put together a messaging tool guide with the Childcare for Every Family Network. And what we've said is that we think it's important to lead with the values, right? A point that's been made repeatedly in this conversation is that childcare is part of our essential infrastructure. Just like roads, bridges, public schools, everyone should have access to childcare that meets their unique needs, and our childcare providers should be receiving good wages and benefits. It's something that everyone can agree with, and it's something that we can strive toward. And then you can explain the problem, because I don't think everyone is on the same page, and that's also an issue that has come up in this conversation. So, unfortunately, in America, childcare is seen as a personal problem that families must solve for. Childcare is too hard for families to find and afford, and our providers aren't making enough money to get by. And then you want to bring this in and share a collective vision. So, what we want is a fully funded childcare system that would support parents and families in participating in their communities and caring for their families. And it would also allow providers to receive good wages and benefits. And then you want a call to action. And it's something that all people who are supporting affordable childcare have to be fairly consistent about, because otherwise policymakers don't know what you're asking them to do. And you can't hold policymakers accountable for following through with something very, very specific. And so in this case, I think the ask should be, or the network thinks the ask should be, we need Congress to fund a childcare system that's going to work for our kids, for our providers, for our communities, our economy. Because if the wealthiest individuals and corporations were to pay their fair share in taxes, there would be more than enough money to create the kind of childcare ecosystem that we need.
I think one key element when you are speaking to your state legislature, to your federal elected officials, is you really have to know that person's background or driving force. If you're speaking to somebody who sits on the economic development community, then you need to talk about how childcare is bringing more people into the workforce. If you're speaking to somebody who sits on the K through 12 and higher education committees, you need to talk about fourth grade reading, eighth grade math, and how being in an early childhood environment, a quality environment, helps kids learn social emotional skills, pre-academic skills, and then they're ready to enter kindergarten. If you're talking to a legislative member who is more conservative and doesn't want to fund a lot of family support programs, you talk about how a working family with quality childcare can be more independent if they have that childcare in place so that they can have those full-time jobs. If you're talking about somebody who's an advocate for child welfare system, childcare is a preventative measure. Families who are at risk of child abuse, they do so much better when the parent and the child get a break from each other, because we all know how stressful parenting is. And all of us, all parents need a break at times, and childcare can be that break that helps families be successful and not end up with more children in the foster care system. So I think sometimes it's doing research on the person that you're presenting your case to, finding out the issues that are important to them, and then showing how childcare directly relates to those issues. And so that, as an advocate, it puts work on you. You have to do your research on the people that you're pitching the idea to. But childcare is one of those issues that is bipartisan because it does affect so many fields. And if you can put together your arguments and figure out what the elected official really cares about, then I think we can make a good case. We just have to make sure that everybody understands its importance.
Sarah, I think that's a really good point, that childcare is just not an issue for working families. It's an issue that affects the entire community's economy. It affects the entire community's well-being when you think about healthcare, when you also think about education. I mean, it literally is this interdisciplinary issue that cuts across everything. And when we fail to deliver quality childcare, we're going to fall behind in all these other areas. And so it really does have the ability to maybe meet the legislator where they are, and kind of how you are talking to them about it. I will also say, as we are in an election year, it's up to us as constituents to hold our elected officials accountable. I mean, if they're not prioritizing childcare, let's talk about it and make sure that they do. So it's not treated as this kind of like afterthought or political football that's constantly on the chopping block. So I think we have a lot of different opportunities to do this and kind of continue to push the needle forward. I want to remind our audience that we do have a few more minutes to take questions, but while we are waiting for some other questions to trickle in, I just want to maybe open it up to our panelists and kind of thinking about, in our final 5 minutes of our panel today, what's maybe one thing you really hope the audience takes away with as far as setting our future up for success with childcare in rural America?
I would say to start at the grassroots level, because your local elected officials need to hear from parents, from childcare business owners, and from business owners. When I go to Frankfurt, my state capital, I'm a great voice as an advocate, but I'm not the person that they want to hear from. They want to hear from the people in their area, their constituents, and know how it's affecting their local communities. And to do that, we have to have people that call and reach out. And so grassroots campaigns really make a huge, huge effort. And to get all of our parents invested, like a day without childcare, where parents understand the importance. When parents reach out, when small businesses reach out, those are some really powerful voices at the table. So please don't discount those local efforts.
I would say to have some hope. I think there's a certain amount of idealism that's necessary for policymaking, because you have to believe that change is possible. Otherwise, you're not going to try to begin with. And the reality is that when it comes to childcare policy, there's actually been a fair amount of progress over the past decade. And so it's easy to look at rising childcare prices and a increasing shortage of programs and say, well, things are just getting worse. Why should I try? But in reality, states are really trying to step up. Localities are really trying to step up and invest more money than we have ever seen in childcare. They are trying to do their part in their own ways. And sure, this might be a little state by state, but this is due in no small part to the advocacy of people living in those states. So exactly what Sarah said, this is a lot to do with organizing and with people saying, this is something that we want to happen. This is something that we're really committed to. So when in, New Mexico, they passed a constitutional amendment, guaranteeing a right to affordable childcare. And now that they're funding childcare for virtually all of the families in New Mexico, that didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because the people who are living in New Mexico organized, and they planned, and they worked to make this happen over a period of years and years and years. That was a lot of advocacy. It was a lot of work, but they believed that it was possible and they made it happen. And so I'd say it's easy in the world that we're living in now to lose hope, and you can't do that if you want actual policy change to happen.
Well, I couldn't agree more with Lea and Sarah, but I would just say one of the unique things in our legislature is that over the past probably decade, we've started electing legislators and policymakers who really represent a broad range of constituencies and age groups. We have a lot of young parents in the legislature in Minnesota, and the coalition of us have really come together to bring voice to this. And I can't tell you the number of points that have been brought up by reporters, other legislators, and other folks about, man, 20 years ago, the Minnesota legislator would have never talked about childcare. And now that we have these young parents who are in these positions to really raise this voice, I think that is really important. And you can use that on other issues other than just childcare. Elect people that have the life experiences that match the communities they represent, that match the challenges that we face in modern America. And I think you'll start seeing results because those very people understand the impacts of those issues and can bring voice to it in the places of power. So I hope folks will, to Sarah's point, get involved at the grassroots level and try to elect the people that will take this seriously.
Well, this is all very appropriate too, as we are coming up to an election year. And Lea, you mentioned too in some of your earlier comments that your organization has put together a messaging toolkit of sorts to help people think through messaging. Can you maybe share with people where to go if they would want to learn more so they could effectively communicate to their policymakers?
I think the messaging guide that we created might be internal, but I will say there are so many good messaging tips from the Childcare for Every Family Network. Does the chat go publicly? Like if I drop the name or a link in this chat, do participants see it or should I just send something later? I'll
I'm
type
not
it as
sure.
a text. It's the Childcare for Every Family Network, and I'm happy to follow up with resources as well.
Great. Because I think part of sometimes knowing what to do is where to start. And when there's a toolkit and places to go, that makes it a lot easier. So we're getting everybody involved in this conversation. We, of course, always want the advocates, but we need parents and grandparents and neighbors that are all, singing from the same sheet of music and talking about the criticality of childcare for our community. So I just want to, thank Sarah and Lea and Grant for being with us today at our World Summit and talking about childcare across this country. I mean, we know it's always top of mind and thinking through the important work that you guys are doing and the innovative solutions. And I think also sometimes this can be a doom and gloom conversation, but I'm leaving today very hopeful thanks to our experts on the panel and the work that's being done, and we know will continue to happen across this country. So please stay tuned. We will be sharing more, but I want to, in the meantime, we are going to be turning the summit back over to Heidi for our featured conversation with Dr. Teresa Gartner-Dyson and Dr. Paula Hill-Collins from the Health Wagon, who were featured in the documentary If Dreams Were Lightning, the World Healthcare Crisis. And just also a reminder to our viewers on Zoom, please return to the Zoom lobby and then select the featured conversation. And If Dreams Were Lightning from the list of sessions, that's the one that you pick. And for our viewers on Facebook that are streaming, we'll resume in a little bit. But thank you all for joining me today on our childcare panel. It's a real pleasure. Bye, everyone.